I'm recording this at the end of January. 3 weeks ago, I was admitted to a hospital where I remained for 2.5 weeks as the fine folks on the oncology ward tried to resolve my graft versus host disease, which had infiltrated my liver. Today's an outpatient day, and we're looking at my labs, and everything seems to be a lot better. So, yay. But during the time I was in hospital, I had an opportunity to reflect on what the next 6 months are going to look like in terms of how busy I'd be, how much energy I'd have, what work I'd be taking on, and like that. I'd already decided to cancel all of my major travel for the first half of 2024. More simply, I'm not planning on getting on any airplanes. No matter how much I wanted to attend this convention or that event, it just didn't seem prudent to be sharing air with all those other people. My current plan is to stick with that moratorium and reevaluate where things stand in July. I'm hoping to attend the NASFIC in Buffalo, New York, as well as the 33rd annual conference of the Klingon Language Institute in Indiana. Other travel may still take place in terms of simply hopping into my car and driving off somewhere to have lunch with a different author every week, just to keep my hand in and still feel part of the community. The other thing to mention here is I'm learning to get better at saying no. When I get invited to various projects, this is hard for me because there's that whole fear of missing out thing. FOMO, I think they call it. Months down the line, that book that I've been invited to contribute to will come out, and I'll look at the table of contents and I'll see all the people I know and what amazing things they've done with the theme of that anthology and think, oh man, I wanted to do that too. But I can't do all the things. It's just not, workable. I have far too many of my own projects to do, let alone taking on these other opportunities. It's regrettable, but it wouldn't be responsible of me to do them. Of course, there are exceptions. An old friend recently contacted me and invited me to have a story in an upcoming anthology. Before I say no, he added, and if you don't have time to write something fresh, we'll happily look at reprints. Oh, that's different. I've got lots of reprints, and selecting one that might fit his theme wasn't a huge time sink for me. Or a writer that I greatly admire reached out and said, hey, Lawrence, we have a new book coming out. Would you mind blurbing it? How do I say no to that? Anyway, I've also taken on a project involving the failed Peregrine lander Writers on the Moon effort because I found that so inspirational, and I volunteered to do something to commemorate all that work that went up on Peregrine and sadly did not end up on the moon. That's a big project and it's running in the background, and I'll have more to say about it soon, so keep watching this space. But really, I'm trying not to take on other deadlines, not least because I have novels and novellae to write, and that's going to keep me plenty busy. Of course, that could change. So let's talk aliens. One of the alien races we meet a couple of times in the Conroy stories are the Sasnak. Those of you who are following along at home know that Sasnak is simply the name Kansas spelled backwards, a nod to the state where I spent 4 long years working on my master's and doctoral degrees. We've seen the Sasnak in Buffalo Contingency, the second Conroy novel, when we meet members of a Sasnakian sex wrestling troupe. So Sasnaks are, or Sasnakians, I suppose, they tend to be very physically fit and hairless, and if memory serves, they're also kind of purply. Now, I don't know if they all fall into such great athletic shape or just the ones that we've met so far. It could be, fat Slavs back on their home world. I don't know. We've never been there, but the ones we have met have all tended to be specimens of great physicality. Let's put it that way. So the first time we see uh, any Cessnakians, it's not in the Conroy story at all. They have their own story, or at least a single Cessnakian has his own story, entitled Smooth Maneuver. The premise of that story is that a delegation from Sasnak has arrived on Earth, and this is early on in the days when the galaxy is first contacting the Earth. And so it's a big deal every time one of these aliens come off their ship to meet and mingle with humans. Typically with our upper crust, which is to say, celebrities and famous politicians, great artists and actors, and so forth. A group of these humans go off with a single alien and they have a meal somewhere in some fancy restaurant. Seems like a good way to meet aliens if you travel in the right circles. Anyway, I said a story at such a meal, and one of the humans was a physician who's been to these meals a couple of times before, and he's become suspicious because he's noticed a pattern emerging around one specific alien. The thing you need to know is that the sexual organs of Sasnakians are all internal. They lack primary external genitalia, and their internal organs involve large bands of muscle. So this particular Sasnak has a game he likes to play while dining out with the humans. At some point in the meal, he pretends to choke. Invariably, some famous human leaps up and grasps him around the waist and begins plunging his or her balled fists into the alien's stomach in what used to be called the Heimlich maneuver. By the way, it's not called that anymore, apparently, because the family of Dr. Heimlich were getting sued by people who were doing the maneuver wrong and blamed him. But I digress. Anyway, our physician realizes that the Sasnak delegate is not, in fact, in any danger or distress. Quite the opposite. Rather, he's basically using his dinner companions for assisted masturbation. Yeah, I know, it's kind of a sleazy thing, but I put it in the story anyway. And in fact, other than a truly horrible pun that ends the story, it's about all that's in the story. Now, the thing about this story is I wrote it and I sent it off to a magazine called Blue Food, one that I'd seen on a market list. The magazine identified itself as an alternative lifestyle magazine, and in hindsight, I guess I had no idea what that meant. But they bought the story. They paid good money for it. And about the time of that issue coming out with my story, I was going to be at the Los Angeles Book Festival, where I'd have a booth for about an hour. Naturally, I shared the news with the folks at Blue Food, and they very generously sent me several boxes of the issue of the magazine with my story for me to hand out. I thought this was great, as it meant I'd have something to sign and give away from my festival booth. Well, it wasn't until those boxes arrived that I saw the magazine, and it was not the kind of magazine I thought it was going to be. I was not completely comfortable with all of the content. There were some things in there that were a little out there. I decided, yeah, this isn't something I want to put out there at the LA Book Festival. In the end, those boxes ended up in my sister's house, where I think my brother-in-law and I used them as insulation, so it all worked out. But that was Blue Food, and that was the introduction of the Sasnak. I resurrected them for the second Conroy novel, Buffalo Contingency, and made them into a troupe of gymnasts. I wouldn't go so far as to label them as sex workers, but they are certainly sexual performers, and their antics have an arousing effect on their audiences. And that's all I have to say about the Sasnak at this time. So let me end this month's questions and anecdotes with three things about the amazing Conroy. When I first began to write about him, I put a few restrictions in place. The idea behind this was to provide some structure and consistency. Well, at least that's what I called it. That first story, though, was supposed to just be a standalone, and so it didn't need a lot of structure, let alone consistency, because we were never going to see the CI again. And then we did. So I started running with things. One of those things being that Conroy is always written in the first person. I thought that one through very deliberately. I tend to split my writing up between first and third, and there are advantages to each. With third person, you can wander around the scene. You don't have to be inside the character's head. You can share with the reader information that your protagonist doesn't have. But I didn't want that for Conroy. I needed him to be first person. Everything we know as the reader, and all we know as the reader, is what Conroy himself knows, because he experienced it directly and we're in his head. When you write from that perspective, you sacrifice a lot. You give up things that you can't share as easily with the reader. It can be hard. But in exchange, you get an immediacy. You get his reactions much more directly. That means, as the author, I'm not telling you how he's responding. We're seeing it from his point of view. We understand it as he breaks it down himself and responds. And I think that makes a difference, an immediacy that lends itself very well to Conroy the hypnotist. He's in the moment, he's very experiential. Sometimes it's more obvious than others, but that's the intention behind it, and it's done very deliberately. Another thing you'll see in almost all the Conroy stories, which is more about story than craft, is there's somebody with some mental or psychic ability, very broadly defined. We see this from the very first story when we meet the Arconi, who, when they're looking at you, know whether you're telling the truth or not. We have the butcher assassin who can stalk you in your dreams. We have the telepathic Taurian who can read your mind as you play a card game with no rules, and on like that. And at some level, part of what's driving the story is the idea that Conroy is interacting with these people with these wildly different mental abilities. It's an odd set of experiences to have undergone, and he's gotten good at it. He's become familiar with it. And in fact, in one story, he's singled out by the government because he's one of the very few people on Earth to have encountered so many different kinds of what we might loosely define as telepathy. That's become, if not exactly a running gag, something of a theme. Whether it's a celestial, tapping him on the forehead and saying, "Is this pain?" as it floods his senses with agony, or Reliape in the second novel, who can, in effect, roll back working memory a good 10 to 15 seconds so that customers don't remember that they've already tipped her and will tip her again at the bar, and so forth. Conroy has a wider range of experiences than most people, even people who are out there in the galaxy beyond Earth. Most of them have encountered one such alien or human with extrasensory perception or powers like this. Conroy is racking them up. It's like he's a collector. So that's another fun thing I like about him. The last thing I'll tell you, of course, is that Conroy is a gourmand, as distinct from a gourmet. He doesn't know how to cook. I mean, he can cook some things, but he's not a chef. What he is someone with a fine appreciation for food. And not just fancy food, but all well-made food. Good eats is good eats, whether he's dining at a five-Michelin star restaurant or picking up street food from a vendor. He knows what's good, and he knows what he likes, and he seeks it out. It's the best and main way he knows for spending money. It's also why he liked doing cruise ships, by which I mean space cruise ships, because they typically have a wide variety of great food, and we see some of that in some of the stories and some of the books. Or he lands on a planet and he goes to a restaurant where there's a fusion of different kinds of cuisine, sometimes fusions of different alien cuisines or fusions of terrestrial cuisines with alien cuisines. Some of the stuff I make up, some of it is based on real and often fancy restaurants. When my wife accompanies me to the larger conventions like the World Science Fiction Convention, she's coming not so much to do the con, she's coming because she's a chef. And while I'm doing the convention, she's making dinner reservations all around whatever city we're in. We try some high-end restaurants, and we're having these incredible experiences every night, and we're putting together dinner parties, and it's a blast. It's just a different side of the world con than most people experience. All the while, I'm stealing ideas from those menus, repurposing them, and they're showing up in the Conroy stories because, as I said at the outset, he's a gourmand. This also sets up scene in Left John Walker's Chinese restaurant in Newark, Jersey, where Conroy is brought in to consult on the menu. I have a lot of fun coming up with very strange names of dishes. Ancestral chicken reclining is one of my favorites, and you should try it the next time you stop by. Anyway, so that's Conroy and three things you probably didn't realize about him. Always in the first person, always encountering telepathic aliens, and always on the lookout for a good meal.